Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending tonight's debate. I'm Ed Byrne, the Principal and President of King's, and it's great to see you all here. And it's a special pleasure for me to introduce a debate on this incredibly important, and I have to say sometimes a little off-putting topic, but I'm sure it will be fair square on tonight. And the topic, of course, is death, clinical, historical and philosophical perspectives on dying, or put more simply, we're all going to die, how should we think about death? This is a topic which has been of great interest to me for many years. I remember as a young medical doctor sitting beside my first elderly patient who died as I sat with them for a couple of hours and watching that amazing and absolutely definitive transition from life to death, which I saw on many occasions after that. I remember as a young neurologist in Australia working on national guidelines for brain death and then certifying many patients with brain death in the intensive care unit, a very challenging and emotionally draining experience. And for much of my neurology career, I looked after many of the patients in Victoria and southern Australia with motor neurone disease, and I followed them from diagnosis made by me to their almost inevitable death a few years later, and supported them, helped them, and helped understand a little of the issues they were dealing with in their journey. So I think this is an incredibly important topic. It's something that we all have to face both personally and in our families. Probably we all have already to some extent. And I hope tonight's debate is both intellectually stimulating and helpful in casting light on this challenging topic. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. I'd like to just start by thanking Professor Byrne for his kind introduction. And add my welcome to his. It's a tremendous pleasure to see you all here, ladies and gentlemen, for what should be a fascinating evening. My name is Sasha Golob. I'm a lecturer here at King's, and I'm the chair and organizer of this panel. As the professor said, and as it said on the flyer for this event, we are all going to die. There's nothing we can do about this fact. It's the one unavoidable fact, perhaps. But what is open to each of us is how we should think about that, how we should react to it, how as a society we should plan for it or consider it. The aim this evening is to bring together a number of perspectives, philosophical, historical and clinical, on these issues of death and dying that we must all face. We'll begin with a historical perspective, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to look at some of the ways in which key thinkers from the past have thought about these questions, to what degree their views have been similar to ours, to what degree their views have been radically divergent. Have they thought both about dying and perhaps about taking one's own life? After that, we will have a philosophical debate. We'll look at some of the classical philosophical questions surrounding these themes. Can you be harmed after you're dead? Is it rational to fear death? To what degree should the fact that we are all going to die alter the things that we value or aim for in our lives? Finally, we'll conclude with a clinical perspective. How should our medical practitioners deal with the process of death, and how might that medical practice need to alter or evolve in the face of changing demographics and changing circumstances? Each speaker will talk for about 10 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll then have about 45 minutes for a Q&A. As I said, this is an issue we all have a stake in, but I think we all bring very different perspectives to it. And so I'm very much looking forward to hearing what each of you have to say on those issues. We'll have plenty of time in which to do that. Finally, once that's done, there'll be a reception afterwards, which I believe is in chapters. So there'll be a glass of wine for you all there, and I hope you'll join the panellists and I for that. So we're going to begin to get us underway with Dr. John Callanan, who will be talking from a historical angle. Thank you.
Okay, so don't worry.
Exactly.
Thanks, Sasha. Sasha and the principal have mentioned about 4 times now that we're all going to die. I thought we were talking about death in general, just realised it applies to me, so I'm a little nervous, I'm a little shook. So let me just try and gather it a little bit. I'm going to talk, since we're talking about death, we may as well go straight to the important issue, which is suicide. So keep it on a cheery theme. Camus said it was the one serious philosophical problem. I work mostly in the history of philosophy and 18th century philosophy, mostly on the work of Immanuel Kant, who famously or infamously thought that there was an absolute prohibition on suicide in all circumstances. And so what we're going to talk a little bit about today is about why one might think that there are never ever occasions on which it might be appropriate to bring about one's own death by one's own hand. Intuitively, there might be occasions such as this of killing yourself in an appropriate way. But Kant has had this very stark view. But I think when we think about it in its historical context, we can see some of the reasons why he maintained such an uncompromising view that show up some of the differences in the way that different people thought about death in the 18th century than the way we do now. For example, that existential question from Camus wouldn't have been one that was on the cards for the philosophers I'm interested in, such as Rousseau, Hume, Kant, lesser-known ones like Bernard de Mandeville, who's my personal favourite, and Maupertuis and Voltaire. But they're more interested in is death always a bad thing? One reason why you might want to bring about death is because you think that life is meaningless, but that's not the view of these philosophers. They think life has meaning. It's just the question is, what is that source of meaning that gives life its special value? And once you identify the meaning of life and the value of life, you can perhaps identify the cases under which death might be appropriate, seeking out one's own death. I'm more interested in the broad historical culture of the time, because a lot of the philosophers, and especially Rousseau and Kant, were interested in not so much particular arguments, but how life and death are viewed in the broader culture of their times. Okay. You didn't miss anything. Doing my deep research for this talk, I was looking at the cartoon Futurama, which has a scene in it where our hero goes into what he thinks is a phone booth, but it's the set of the future. It's a suicide booth where you can put in 25 cents and have your troubles taken care of, either quickly and painlessly, or slow and excruciatingly, whichever way you prefer. And strangely, it thanks you for visiting afterwards. Now, I find that this is funny because it's also bizarre and appalling in some kind of way, the idea that the act of suicide could be commodified in this way, could be as convenient as taking paracetamol for a headache. So I take it that we find there are perhaps some upper limits on what's acceptable in ways of taking one's own life, that we can't imagine a society, hopefully we can't really imagine a society where this is a reality. But at the same time, I think we have a far more permissive idea regarding possible conditions in the way, whether it's reasonable to take one's own life than they did in the past. So, for example, the kind of classic location of the prohibition on suicide comes from Plato's Phaedo, but the rationale there isn't a great one. There, our existence, we are the properties of the gods. And how would you feel if your property just extinguished itself all of a sudden? So don't extinguish yourself. Similarly, Locke in his second treatise on government suggests we've been designed to preserve life. Don't ruin your design. That's a gift from your designer. So don't go against your design. Rousseau is quite scathing. Your existence in both these cases is kind of a gift from some higher power that you're not supposed to squander. Rousseau is quite scathing about these kind of things. It says if it's really a gift, it's yours to dispose of. And it's not a gift, you can give it back. There you go. So they're not very sympathetic to these kinds of stories about why you ought to preserve your life. But more worryingly, I think, were the kind of stories about why it might be okay to take one's life. And Kant was, as I mentioned, was opposed to it. He thought you could never make it a principle of your own self-interest, that is, to do it for oneself, to end one's life. There does sound at the face of it something contradictory about it, that it might be in your interests to end your capacity to enjoy anything. But of course, it does make sense that it can be in your interest to end your suffering. So you can make it your principle of self-love, as he puts it, to end your suffering. But Kant has a general worry about these things, about where you're going to draw the line and what counts as the tipping point to when this kind of behavior is acceptable. Is it because you have a very bad future ahead of you? Is it because you have a very bad year in front of you? Or is it because you've had a very bad day? Which counts as sufficient grounds for when your suffering is such that you can take it away? Kant goes the other way and says never. Now again, that seems a bit too harsh. In fact, he seems even more harsh about it, and says not only can you never do it to suit yourself, you can never just kill yourself to ease your temporary difficulty, but he also says those cases that seem as if they're good cases, where you could take your own life on principle, aren't. And now this was quite a controversial thing to say in the day, because, and this is something I think you have to try and get back into the historical context to appreciate, which is that there were thought to be at the time a certain category of suicide, which is a kind of a noble, virtuous, righteous suicide. Now, suicides don't have that same kind of cachet in our culture. You can fight, of course, and risk your life, but you're not actively bringing about your own death. You're risking your death for a cause. But there were, and when we think of suicides now, we attach them more to certain romantic ideals, I think. Often the famous suicides in popular culture are artistic suicides. And also people, I should put some general disclaimer, none of the philosophers I'm going to talk about are mental health professionals. None of them are dealing with individuals who are suffering with serious problems. They're talking more about what is the very concept of taking one's own life in general. How does it feed into our popular culture? Could it ever feed into a way where suicide movements were allowed? So the two figures, which I know you all know, you're anticipating me saying, that were extremely popular. Every educated person knew them in the 18th century, and everyone knew that who you'd be talking about when you're talking about noble suicides were Cato and Lucretia. Cato, in case you've forgotten, was the Roman senator who opposed Caesar, and when he lost the battle, killed himself rather than succumb to Caesar's rule. It was a battle over who was going to be in charge and who was going to have the authority, and he said, better to die than to submit, and the worst of all, be pardoned by Caesar, and implicitly acknowledge that Caesar had political authority. So he killed himself. Very inelegantly. With a knife, and he fell out of bed, and people came to try and rescue him. He said, no, get away, and pulled out his own entrails to speed it up. It wasn't good at killing himself, but it was brave. So, and the other case, even more traumatic, was of Lucretia, who was a semi-legendary figure from the early Roman Republic, who was raped by Tarquin and was threatened that she'd be killed, and her name would be sullied, and then with her chastity and her virtue and her purity impugned, she couldn't live with herself afterwards, and she stabbed herself, causing and bringing about wars that led to the setup of the Roman Republic in many ways. These were both taken as two people who couldn't live in this state where their principles were besmirched in this way. But there's also a kind of a history of suspicion about these kinds of characters. And Kant, and my favorite Mandeville, has a suspicion. Montaigne, in his essays, said something strange about Cato. He really rushed joyously into that suicide. He really was pleased to have found, as he quotes Cicero, a reason for dying. Here's the kind of heavy bit. Again, we're all dying. We're all dying somewhat senselessly. There's no particular reason for why our particular end will come about, but at least Cato found a particular reason for why he was dying. And there was a certain comfort in that. And there was also, as Mandeville points out, glory. We can kill ourselves to end our suffering, but there's a much more powerful, positive reason why we might do it, which he thinks our esteem, our pride, our image, our reputation, our name in history. He thinks this can drive a lot of behavior that looks on the front of it to be ethical behavior. And so Cato, at the end of the day, wanted the glory. He didn't want to pardon himself to Caesar and live in political oblivion. He'd rather die for his principles there, but not for his principles, to be known for dying for his principles. Slightly more controversially and less politically correctly, people were very suspicious about Lucretia's motives as well. Mandeville suggested that it wasn't in fact just the threat of death and the chastity that was impugned that caused her to kill herself. Rather, what happened was, when you look at the details of it, Tarquin threatened to kill her and tell her that she was having an affair, tell everyone she was having an affair with a slave, threatened to ruin her good name. So this was the thing that drove her to kill herself. And what happened in the story, one of the versions of the story, is that Lucretia went back to her father, said, "My name has been ruined, promise me punishment," and then killed herself in front of him. Both Mandeville and Kant said what's going on here is revenge. If you go down the road to the National Gallery, you'll see Rembrandt's show that's on now, and there's two pictures of Lucretia. One where she's just about to kill herself, and she's full of remorse, and she's this picture of virtue besmirched and chastity befouled, and she's full of pain. And then in the next picture they paint 2 years later, it's after she's killed herself, and her look on her face is not one of a victim, it's one of someone who has got her revenge. There's an idea here that pursuit of death can be done for low motives as well as high ones. Pursuit of your own death as well. So, but both Mandeville and Kant start to doubt these pictures of what are these noble deaths. But not really because they doubt the individuals themselves. They just don't want to tarnish their names, but they're suspicious of how these figures, who are the two figures in history about why it might be appropriate to kill yourself, are used. Cato, which was first played just 500 yards up the road in the Drury Theatre 301 years ago, was used by George Washington to stir up the troops, to send them into battle. It was an example of the highest form of valor was pursuing death. Similarly, Mandeville said the real reason why we talk about Lucretia is not because of anything about morals. It's not anything really about dying for your principles. It's because at the time people liked to use chastity, which Mandeville thought was the most overrated virtue there is. They liked to use the concept of chastity to suppress women, to keep them in line. And what better way to do it than to say there's a paragon individual here who would kill herself rather than live an unchaste life. The point is that they're trying to say is that the use of death gets used as a symbol, and the pursuit of death is always taken by popular culture, not necessarily for bona fide means. So Kant is suspicious about any kind of motivation for why you might pursue your own death. One final example. Maupertuis in the Essai de Philosophie Morale, Maupertuis was a fantastic mathematician and a scientist, not a great philosopher. In fact, Kant and others took this as an example as why you don't get mathematicians to do philosophy. But he said, it's very simple. You take your expectation of how much pleasure you have in the future. You take your expectation of how much pain you have in the future. If the plus column is higher, keep living. If the minus column is higher, get dying. Now, Kant has lots of problems with this. He doesn't think pleasure and pain can be quantified as one thing as well. But this is also presented by Maupertuis as the rational thing to do. This is about how you take mathematics and guide your life in accordance with that. And pursuit of your own death can simply be an exercise of your own rational capacities. And what he's worried about, and Kant says this explicitly, I think, is how this changes how we think of life in popular culture. How we think of death and how we think of life. We start to think of life as a problem to which death is the solution. And in fact, Maupertuis starts calling this illness of existence. He starts thinking that existence itself is a problem. In fact, it's a medical problem. It's a medical problem that we just have to wait until the negative column gets high enough and then we end with the simple expedient of death. Now, in this model, we start to think of death as just paracetamol or anything else that we might avail of in order to take care of problems that we might have. We end up thinking of death as the ultimate paracetamol for our problems. But accompanying that is the idea of life itself as a problem. So there's a failure to integrate just what might be valuable about life. And only when we do that, Kant thinks, can we understand what might be the proper context in which death might ever be appropriate.
Fantastic, thank you very much, John. And I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, which is Professor David Papenow from the Department of Philosophy. David is going to be talking about death and harms, amongst other things. David.
Right, thank you very much. So, as Sasha so kindly reminded us at the beginning, we're all going to die. And what Clayton and I are going to talk about is what we should think about this prospect. Should we be worried? There's quite a lot of philosophers going back to antiquity who say, no, we shouldn't be worried. They say, sure, the process of dying, what Catherine's going to speak about later, maybe that's going to be nasty and something to worry about, or maybe it's not. But putting that to one side, the actual being dead, what's to be worried about there? They say, look, it's going to be nothing. What's so bad about nothing? Actually, I think they're wrong. I think it is bad. I think the prospect that next year I not be there, there's nothing, is something that's bad, and I would be worried about were it to happen, so to speak. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about something more specific. I'm going to talk about whether we can be further harmed after we're dead by things that happen when we're dead. Things that don't directly involve us, but as I'll say, harm us. So, on my view, and I'm going to say, yes, we can. So, in my view, it's kind of doubly bad. Not only is the fact, as Sasha so nicely reminded us, we're all going to be dead, that's bad, but there's something else to worry about. Even after you're dead, further things can happen that are bad for you. I'm going to look at a rather specific example, but I think it's one that has general implications, and indeed practical implications. I think the fact that people can be harmed after they're dead often gives us who aren't yet dead reason to do things to preserve their interests. Let me give you a little story. It's a rather specific story, but I want to use the story to bring out the points I want to make. So imagine that Jane is your aunt of somewhat advanced years, and she's been spending the last 10 years writing a book about the butterflies of East Sussex. And then she dies suddenly and unexpectedly. The book's complete, but a bit disordered. There's a publisher lined up, but there's still work to do to tidy up the typescript, send it off to the publisher, and so forth. You're her not very close, but closest relative, and it falls to you to decide whether to make sure the book is published or just to chuck it in the bin. Let me focus the issue a bit more. Let me specify that it won't really make any difference to anybody alive if the book is published or not. And Jane doesn't have any close friends or family who feel personally pleased or distressed. I mean, the book's okay. It's going to recover the publisher its costs, but there are other books that cover the same ground, and the stuff's all in the journals for serious scholars. It really isn't going to add to the general stock of good in the world if the book is published or not. In fact, look, I'll specify that as far as the general good is concerned, it would be better that the book's not published. The publishers will go on and do something slightly more worthwhile. And the reason I'm making this point is I want to specify that if her book were thrown away, then it would be bad for her and not anybody else. She's the only person to whom the publication of the book matters. She's the only one who spent 10 years working towards getting the book published. Even so, even though she's the only person who will be harmed, it seems clear to me that you'd have reason, after she's dead, to do what she would have wished. Even though the only person whom it matters is dead, you've got reason to get her book published. Now, sure, the reasons mightn't be compelling. As I've said, might be better for the general good it wasn't published. It's going to be a nuisance for you to do all this, and you might decide, look, it's not really worth it. But that doesn't alter the point that there is some reason to get the book published. Maybe outweighed by consideration on the other side, but still, they deserve to be taken into account. And I think if you accept that, then this shows that the dead can be harmed by what happens after they're dead. After all, what other reason is there for getting the book published, apart from the fact that failing to get it published will harm your now dead aunt? I've specified nobody else is going to benefit. So the only person whose interest can possibly weigh on the side of getting the book published is Jane's interest, and she's dead. So I think that's a case that illustrates how dead people can be harmed by things that happen after they're dead. I mean, that's a slight silly example that I wanted to use to focus the issue, but if you think it has very general application, as many people have projects, they haven't come to fruition when they die. There are many people who care about their reputations, about how they're remembered and so on, and what people do after they're dead make a great deal of difference to how those things pan out. Okay, I guess some of you are thinking, look, isn't there something strange about the idea that the dead can be harmed? I actually don't think it's so strange at all. And I'll just finish by looking at one reason you might have for thinking that the dead can't be harmed and showing that it's not a good reason. I mean, there's more to be said. There's quite a lot of philosophical debate about this, but I'll just look at this one thought. Here's a thought. Well, hang on. The person who's dead, they're not going to be upset. They're not going to be hurt. They're not going to be harmed in a way that involves any psychological distress. Doesn't that mean that they're not going to be harmed? Well, it would mean that they're not going to be harmed if it were true that matters of harm and benefit were always matters of personal pleasure and pain. If the only way that you could be hurt or advantaged is by being made to suffer or not. That's a hedonistic theory of harm and benefit. And if that were true, well, then dead people certainly couldn't be harmed. But I think if you think for a bit, you can see that the hedonistic theory of harm and benefit is a crass and vulgar theory that we shouldn't take too seriously. Look, I mean, suppose that your partner and your best friend are having an affair, and they're, being your partner and best friend, very clever and considerate, and they make sure that you never have any inkling of it. So you're not made to suffer, you're not distressed, but are you harmed? It seems to me pretty obvious that you are. Here's a philosophical thought experiment. Robert Nozick said, well, if you're a hedonist, what would be wrong with this? We'll make an experience machine, a kind of box, fancy box, you get wired up, and from now on, we arrange things that everything is really delightful. You get all kinds of pleasant experiences. In fact, we make sure you get just all the experiences that you would get if your life were to go in the way you wanted, even though it's not really, because you're just hooked up in a box. And Nozick invented this example because he expected, quite rightly, most people would think that the good life that you have in the experience machine, where you have all the pleasure and none of the suffering that would matter if you're a heavenist, that life is not nearly as worthwhile as a life in which you really are engaging with other people in the real world. So I think examples like this show that the idea that the only way you can be harmed is by being made to have feelings of distress is as I said, a rather superficial theory. You can be harmed by your projects not coming to fruition. You can be harmed by your reputation being damaged, by people wrongly maligning you. And I think in all those kinds of ways, the dead can be harmed, and we should take pains to avoid them being harmed in that way. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. So, a crass and vulgar theory, he says, and I'm delighted to introduce then the very uncrass and unvulgar Dr. Clayton Littlejohn, who is going to tell us why David is wrong, amongst other things.
Well, thanks to all of you for coming, for David for setting this up so well. Maybe I should have gone ahead of you. So, I mean, there are two questions that I want to discuss just very briefly. We have about 10 minutes. I want to talk about whether death is something to fear and whether death is bad. Could be bad for any of us. And Epicurus thought these questions were connected, and what he aimed to do was try to show that death isn't something to fear. Fear is not the appropriate attitude towards death. And the reason it's not appropriate to take the attitude of fear towards death is in part because death can't be bad for the one who dies. It can't ever be bad for the one who dies. So there's this letter to, and I have to apologize to anyone who actually does ancient philosophy. Is it Menesius? Let's say Menesius. It's a letter to Menesius, and it goes something like this. Accustom yourself to believing that death is nothing for us, because all good and evil consists of sensation. Death is the end of sensation, so a correct understanding of death, which is that it's nothing to us, should make the mortality of life more enjoyable, not by promising to add more existence, as it were, on the back end, but just by reminding you that when it's all over, that has no significance for you at all. Whatever causes you no annoyance when it's present could only pain you in the prospect, but of course, since you know that it could only pain you in the prospect, it wouldn't really be reasonable for you to let it pain you at all. That was the gist of it. And he gave some other arguments that we might discuss later about why death couldn't possibly harm any of us, but I think that's good enough for now. So here's what I like about the way he approaches this. He thinks that he can sort of, as it were, settle the question about whether it's appropriate to be afraid of death by settling a question about whether death could be harmful. And the argument he gives for why death can't be harmful appeals to premises that I think maybe not everyone in the room accepts, but a lot of us do. I like to think that we're material beings. I like to think we're material beings that can feel pleasure and pain, but I like to think that, with our death kind of comes the end of us. And I do like in the pub to debate with friends about whether we exist for a little while as corpses or whether we sort of go away and there's just a corpse left over. That for me is a really fun question. But, my friends don't take seriously questions like, do we continue to exist in some sort of thinking, feeling form after our death? And it's important that I surround myself with these people, because to the extent that I can sustain, right, the idea that death will be an experiential blank, then I feel like I'm home free, right? Because if I can maintain the certainty that death really will be nothing to me experientially, and I really do think then that death couldn't, as it were, be painful or pleasant or any of these kinds of things, then I feel like I can reasonably, as it were, not fear death. I mean, to fear death, it seems like a number of conditions would have to be met. Death would have to be bad for you. That's one of them. There would have to be some uncertainty also about, right, what death would be like and how bad it would be for you. That's also important. And there'd have to be this real probability, right, that death would be bad for you. So if you really can convince yourself that death could be nothing to you, the question as to whether it should be feared, right, just doesn't arise. But then, of course, we turn to the really difficult question, right? Are there convincing philosophical reasons to think that death is nothing to us, right? And like I said, this is why I like to surround myself with materialists and atheists, because they'll convince me that with death, right, really comes the end of me as a thinking, feeling subject. And as long as I can sort of maintain certainty in those propositions, that's fine. What a lot of people do, though, is they're willing to spot Epicurus these metaphysical assumptions about the nature of persons, but they resist his argument not on metaphysical grounds, but on the grounds they think that he has a sort of an overly simplistic, I forgot the word you used. Crass and vulgar conception of well-being. And what these people helpfully try to do is try to convince us that even if we spot Epicurus all the metaphysics, right, we still have something to worry about. So, thanks to David for that. So what they say, right, is that hedonism is just not a terribly plausible view of well-being, but as they see it, right, Epicurus' argument hangs on this hedonistic assumption that all good and evil consists in sensation. Now, I guess I have to say that, like David, I used to think that that was a rather simplistic view. There seem to be lots of other things that could make a contribution to well-being. So the satisfaction of desire, the achievement of something important. These things seem to be things that could make contributions to well-being. And the hedonist says, well, of course they make contributions to well-being, because typically when your desires are satisfied, right, that brings pleasure. And typically when you achieve something significant, that also brings pleasure. But what they warn us against is a kind of double counting. Right? These things matter, but they matter to the extent that they make a contribution to pleasure and pain. They don't have any further significance. Now, some people say that that's not good enough, that things like the satisfaction of a desire or the achievement of something significant, these things have to make a sort of significant contribution to your well-being. And if that's on the table, the thought is that, well, insofar as some of your desires might be frustrated or satisfied because of events that take place after your death, there's at least the potential for things happening after you die having some kind of non-derivative impact on your well-being. I take it that's the thing that David's trying to describe. So one kind of example is, this one's a little bit silly, but I think my grandmother used to always want me to be married. So she died 20 years ago. I don't think I was married at the time. And now there's this question, right, which is, if I hold out, right, for however long, is this going to be bad for her in some sort of non-derivative way? She went to her grave thinking, right, that I'd be married, right? So she died happy in the thought that someday I'd be married. But there's this question about whether my being married would be good for her. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical of this idea, and I'm skeptical of this idea for a few reasons. One is, of course, is she has no epistemic access to whether I ever get married, because I was able to at least put up the pretense while she was still alive. So you might have the following sort of thought, right? The reason that the hedonist view is supposed to be a kind of crude, vulgar view of well-being is that it places all of the elements that directly contribute to well-being right into a subject's consciousness. But what we want, right, is a view on which your well-being could depend upon there being things in the world, even things that you're not aware of, that themselves can make a direct contribution to your well-being if, for example, you're committed to them, or you love them, or you desire them to be, or things like that. And when I think about these kinds of examples, I worry, one, my grandmother's epistemic access to my marriage or non-marriage seems to me to be a bit of a worry. If she died thinking I'd be married, I think that's at least good for her to some extent. My also being married, I don't think carries, though, a second benefit, not if she never knows about it. Now, that's an epistemic worry, and some people learn to live with those worries, but here's a sort of non-epistemic worry, which is, I think, really fascinating. And this is the kind of thing that Epicurus would push. Suppose I do get married tomorrow, and the idea would be that that would satisfy one of my grandmother's desires, and then that would somehow be good for her. There's a question about when it's supposed to be good for her. And none of the options look terribly good. Is it good for her tomorrow? That seems quite odd. Is it good for her right as she's dying? That's not much better, although some philosophers defend that view. Or is it good for her at those periods in her life when she had the desire? Not really happy with any of those options, but it looks like one of those options has to be the right one. So there are these puzzles about, as it were, the timing, trying to figure out when these things that are supposedly good or bad for people are good or bad for them. And in the absence of good answers, I get worried. But then David has the experience machine thing. And the experience machine is supposed to worry everyone. Now, I don't know how much time I have. 2 minutes? 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm sure experience machine will come up in the Q&A. So I'll go real quickly. one of our former colleagues asked his 8-year-old daughter about the experience machine once, and it was great because they were about to move to another country where she didn't speak the language and she was going to start a new school where she didn't yet have any friends. And she asked, well, why would I go in that machine? And I thought, there's so many good reasons for you to go into that machine. They're going to be so mean to you in your new school. Now, what I think about the experience machine is that the experience machine is good for you at least to some extent, right? No one would think the experience machine is a fate like death. No one would think we should be, as it were, ambivalent about whether we just, as it were, turn the lights out or plug into the machine. So I think one of the questions we should ask then is a question like this about whether life in the machine, if it really matches the life we would have had out of the machine, is it really so obvious that life in the machine is worse? I can fight with you in Q&A about this later. But since time is short, let me just finish with a couple things. One of the really things that's frustrating about Epicurus is he thinks for some reason that hedonism implies that death isn't going to be bad for the one who dies. And that just seems to be an utter non sequitur, right? Because even if all good and evil consists in sensation, and even if we grant that death isn't going to be then positively unpleasant, it's not going to be like sitting in an uncomfortable coach, seat on the bus or something, right? I mean, even if death is an experiential blank, right? Surely an experiential blank is worth then an extended period of time in which your life is filled with pleasure. So it looks like even if you are committed to hedonism, this idea that death isn't going to be bad for you is a bit odd. But where does this leave us? Well, I mean, a couple things I just want to say in closing. Well, one, it gives us at least a sense of how bad death is going to be for us. Because one thing we can do is we can think about the deaths that we will die, and then we can think about the deaths we would have died had we escaped that death. And we can start to get a sense of how bad our deaths are by comparing, as it were, the death that we expect to die and the deaths we would have died otherwise. And when we think about it in those terms, it looks like, at least for a lot of us, we can think, although our deaths, right, might be bad for us, they're probably not going to be terrible for us, right? Most of us are probably going to live quite long, fulfilling lives. And we'll probably die in hospitals of things that there was some chance of being saved from. But it looks like the kinds of things that eventually are going to kill us, right, would quickly be followed by something else that will get us the next go around. And the amount of life that we had left over that we managed to gain through the use of some sort of medical intervention, I mean, it might be positive for us, but it's not like the loss of that is so terrible that the fear of death is something that should control us. So yes, I mean, the hedonist would say, yes, you should fear ways of dying, you should fear the things that might kill you, but the idea that death as such is the kind of thing you should fear, it's a little bit unreasonable. After all, death, as everyone likes to keep reminding us, is inescapable, and the best you can do is forestall it. And by forestalling it, you might avoid a little bit of harm, but you're not going to avoid something so significant that it should keep sort of controlling the way we feel about life. I think that's over 10 minutes, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Clayton. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, we have here two sort of opposing views, metaphysical viewpoints. On one hand, we have Jane, who's calmed when you throw out a butterfly book, even though she's 6 foot under. And on the other hand, Clayton's grandmother, and what she doesn't know about his marital status won't hurt her.
Yes.
So these two sort of opposing viewpoints. I'm now delighted to introduce our fourth speaker, Dr. Catherine Schliemann from the Cicely Saunders Institute, who's going to be bringing a clinical perspective to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm a clinician and academic in palliative medicine, and I would like to talk about doctors and death. This will be a tale of two patients. My first death was at the age of 25. I was a junior doctor, just days out of medical school. Jean was a lady in her 80s who had been admitted to hospital with a problem with her bowel. My team, a surgical team, had hoped that we could fix that problem, that we could do an operation and make her better. But it became increasingly clear that she was deteriorating. There was no way she would survive the operation. She was dying. So what did we do? Well, I'm ashamed to say that we did pretty much nothing. Every day we would do a ward round and we would see all of our patients, except when we got to Jean's room, we would stop just outside the door and we would ask the nurses, any issues overnight, any new problems? And they would usually say, no new issues, no problems. And we would move on. We doctors rarely even stepped foot inside her room. I can't tell you if Jean had any pain or discomfort. I can't even tell you if she knew she was dying. because I didn't ever ask her. The first time I touched her was in order to verify that she was dead. Cicely Saunders, who founded the modern hospice movement and is a KCL alumna, Cicely observed in the 1950s that doctors desert the dying. My experience 4 decades later was that not much had changed. So this is what I would like to talk about. Do doctors desert the dying? I think it's reasonable to say that if we go back a few hundred years, doctors had so little up their sleeves with which to do their doctoring that much of what they did was palliate, tend to the dying. But in the 20th century, things changed, and there were enormous, rapid medical, social, economic advances, and we very quickly became good at something we had never been good at before: saving lives. The result was that the average human lifespan almost doubled over the century. But the trouble is, so good have we become at saving lives, so reliant on the increasing sophistication of medical science in pretty much everything we do, that it seems to me that we appear to have forgotten that in every life there will come a point where it is unsavable. Has anyone yet mentioned that we are all going to die? And while medical science gets better and better, many aspects of death and dying get worse and worse. Death is increasingly medicalized, sterilized, institutionalized, interventionalized, and that's not what our patients want. We know what they want because we've asked them. Our research shows that people who have a potentially short amount of time left to live, they don't choose to prioritize longevity over everything else. They choose being comfortable, symptom-free, surrounded by their loved ones, and in a place of their choosing, which is usually as far away from sophisticated medical science as they can get. But the trouble is, to honor a patient's preferences at the end of life, first you have to ask them what they want. And to ask them, well, first you've got to be honest with them and their family about the fact that they're dying. And that's the tricky bit, because we doctors, we don't like talking about death. In fact, we go out of our way to avoid saying those words, death, dying. We use euphemisms instead. We say things like, we're going to focus on comfort care, when what we mean is, you're dying. And I think it's worth us doctors reflecting on who we're protecting by avoiding these words and these conversations. We might tell ourselves that we're trying to preserve hope, but our research has shown that people want to know if they have a potentially short time left to live. Hope and terminal illness are not mutually exclusive. In recent years, we in palliative medicine have attempted to come up with interventions to help generalists provide better care to the dying, people like Jean. One such intervention, the Liverpool Care Pathway, was subsequently withdrawn in the face of intense media speculation that for some patients it worsened their deaths, didn't improve them. In response this year, the Department of Health gave us the One Chance to Get It Right document. It sets out for healthcare professionals what care of the dying should look like. It's 168 pages long, but its contents can be summarized in one sentence. Be honest with your patients. Ask them what they want and listen to them. I think we have to consider that something may have gone badly wrong if we need 168 pages to tell us that. Meanwhile, junior doctors still leave medical school, as I did, ill-equipped to care for the dying. We teach students anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, hearts, brains, livers, treat, fix, cure. We focus so much on the saving of lives that we forget to tell students what to do when lives are unsavable, producing doctors for whom death means failure. I'm going to tell you about the second patient. Michaela was 33. She was a bright, resourceful woman, a mother of 5 and a single parent. When Michaela was in her early pregnancy with her 5th child, she found out that she had breast cancer. She decided to continue with the pregnancy, even though she knew that that meant delaying the start of chemotherapy. Her pregnancy progressed, but sadly, so too did her cancer, such that by the time her baby daughter was born, her cancer had spread to her bone and to her liver. I met Michaela in her home about 3 months after the birth of her daughter. She was terribly thin, frail, fatigued, barely able to get out of the house. She'd started to notice little nodules under her skin, which were acting as a visible and palpable reminder that things were not going well. I didn't have to use the words death and dying with Michaela, because she used them first. One day when I was visiting her at home, she said, "Catherine, I need to show you something." She leant back on her sofa, lifted up her shirt and showed me a new lump that had appeared under the skin on her abdomen. I knelt by her side and examined it. She said, "Catherine, does this mean that the cancer has spread again?" "Yes, it does." "Does it mean that the treatment isn't working?" "Yes, it does." "Catherine, am I dying?" "Yes, you are." Then it was my turn to ask the questions, still kneeling by her side. I asked her, "What are your priorities?" She said, "I just want to rest." "What are you fearful of?" "I don't want to die alone." "What are you hopeful for?" "That my children will be well supported." The next day, Michaela was admitted to her local hospice, where she spent time sorting out her affairs. She arranged for the lease on her flat to be put into her ex-partner's name so that her children at least kept their home. She made memory boxes, she wrote letters, and she rested. Her mum and her 4 older children came to visit her, but the baby stayed away. I got the impression that she'd already said goodbye. She died very peacefully in the hospice about 3 weeks after she got there. Michaela's death was premature by anyone's standards, but she achieved every goal she set for herself, and in that way her life was more complete than many. Jean died in hospital. In fact, she was comfortable and she had her family around her. I don't think it was a bad death, and yet I wish it had been different, because I wish that I had left that consultant ward round, gone into her room, sat down, held her hand and asked her, "What's important to you? What are you hoping for? What are you frightened of?" A survey published earlier this year showed that fewer than half of terminally ill patients in hospital had been informed that there was a possibility that they might die. Death isn't failure, but not having these conversations is. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. That's a very powerful contribution. So we've had a range of perspectives, ladies and gentlemen, from a historical view to a look at some of the metaphysical or philosophical issues underlying these debates, to a look at the front line of palliative care. And of course there's a whole range of other issues that we haven't touched upon, or at least haven't focused on, but are connected to these topics, and which I'm sure many of you have views on, for example, the assisted suicide policy debate within this country. So what I'd like to do now is open it up to Q&A. We have about 40 minutes, and as I say, both myself and the panelists will be very interested to hear your views on this and your different perspectives on it. We have a number of mics going round, so if people were able to speak into the mics, that would be very helpful. And yeah, we can take the first question. We'd like to go first. Yeah.
Thank you all very much. I'd like to ask the panel generally whether they think that an individual life can be considered as a means or as an end. I'm asking in response to Catherine's point that perhaps there are more important things at the end of life than keeping someone alive, which seems to imply that that individual life is a means to other forms of experience that make it greater and more valuable than the life itself.
Fantastic. Thank you. Who wants to? Catherine, do you want to do that?
I mean, yeah, I completely agree with you that it's not about preserving life at all costs. I think that, I can't remember who said it earlier, but it made me think that actually one of the sort of problems with our new longevity, the fact that we're living longer and longer, is actually we're living longer and longer, but with more medical problems, more multiple comorbidities. And in a strange sort of way, mortality seems even further away for those people for whom it should be closest. So there's a sort of funny reciprocal thing going on there.
Fantastic. Does anyone else want to?
I just think from a historical perspective, perhaps there's very few philosophers have thought that human beings should just be treated as means to whatever ends. But also, I think some of the examples I was trying to talk about is how most of them don't think that life itself is just the be-all and end-all. Usually life is some condition that allows for the realization, whether it's certain kinds of pleasure or other kinds of well-being or other kind of things that a certain kind of living creature is able to value. So, for example, in these particular cases, you might preserve someone's life, but in so doing, rob them of the ability to engage with the activities in which they get their sense of value, integrity, authenticity, perhaps even identity. And they're the things for which life is valuable.
Fantastic. Clint, do you want to? Fantastic. Who wants to go? Yes, sir.
Just wondering if this, and maybe it's for the threshold of a new period to think about this concept of death. We have Google's investment in Calico, which is showing a real focus on life extension. The evidence today of a man able to walk again, the infusion of the stems, severed cord, and the development of robotics and bionics, and the movement towards a singularity event of fusion between computing power and the brain. So is there a point there where we come to perhaps a new concept of life, perhaps acting as ways in a form of death, where you move from being purely biological being into one which is a fusion of mechanics, and perhaps where you take your memories and your experience into a world of the computer, which is similar to the singularity event, your ability to perceive and engage with the world. Now, this would have seemed highly fanciful 10, 20 years ago, but movements in science are so fast that they may well reach us in our current lifetimes, no matter what our ages and sort of touring. And that puts a very interesting concept, I know, to look towards the panel here, about what is death, what's life, and how you see yourself as maybe into a new context of experiencing the world and the loved ones around us by this interface of science and biology, and whether death fits in that concept or not, or whether we go on forever. But we're at that point potentially.
Yeah. So, David, do you want to discuss it?
Let me just start off with one thought which will be familiar to many philosophers here, if not to everybody. Bernard Williams argued famously that indefinite life would not be an obvious blessing. I mean, it's very hard for us to think about what it would be like, but his point was that the whole trajectory of our lives, the way we give meaning to our lives, adopting projects with a limited amount of time to complete them, and then they're done, and then we can relax, and that would just go away if we didn't have any termination. It's not clear why would we do anything today. We've got an indefinite number of days to do it, and so that's just one thought. I mean, I'm not sure how realistic the prospect you have in mind is, but I just want to say, look, it's not at all obvious it's something you should wish for at all.
I think one aspect of Williams's thing was that life would just become intolerably boring were to be immortal. And And I'm not sure if that's right, actually. I think it's, you know, infinity might be challenging, but I spend a lot of time just categorizing types of North American beer at the moment and tastes. Like, I can give a good millennia to that. You know, so you could just, and that's what, and then move on to cheese. But, you know, a failure of dealing with immortality could be a failure of imagination. But there is a sense, I think, that whatever the constitution of the agent, soon there'll be parts of us that won't be all biological, that seems fine. But will we have, as David says, projects, goals, limitations? Sometimes some of the kind of the trauma and the search for meaning that death can give is more about our finitude, our limitation, and that is a slightly broader concept than perhaps death as well. And I think we'll always have something like some sense of the limits of our existence so long as we're finite and bounded in some kind of way.
So, I guess I'm like John. Immortality doesn't sound that bad. But I think on the one hand, on the one hand, I'm sort of, I guess, on the side that if William said that immortality was pretty bad, I start to think it must have been all right. Williams and Nozick, I think, usually pretty reliably indicate the philosophical truth on accident. But I think one worry I have about some of these projects, right, is that they strike me as a sort of very strange use of resources. I mean, we can sink lots of resources in trying to avoid death, but if death isn't really that terrible of a thing, maybe we should have sunk the resources in just improving the quality of life for the people around us. It's not as sexy or exciting, but it does seem to be more valuable. That probably came off slightly more annoying than it should have been, but if I have my hedonist hat on, that's probably the kind of thing I should say, so I'll say.
It's an interesting question of resources because, I mean, from my point of view, if everyone died really well with all of the resources they needed, I would say, yeah, let's keep ploughing stuff into stem cells. I have a PhD in stem cell biology, so I kind of know about that stuff. But actually, you would be amazed what a tiny proportion of, for example, the medical research budget is allocated to palliative and end-of-life care. In this country, of the £1.7 billion spent annually on medical research, 0.1% goes into research that aims to understand how better to provide care to dying patients. I've just given you an example of how we're getting it wrong. That's 10p in every £100 for something that will affect us all and may well affect us all quite badly.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting. You see again the interaction between these sort of very deep metaphysical issues. How will the notion of death and our death change as we change, the type of agents we are change, and then these sort of frontline public policy issues, what percentage of the health budget should we be spending on these devices and palliative care, for example, improving palliative care. Who wants to go next? Yes.
It seems that all the discussions on death seem to be about the death of the individual, but it seems to me personally quite trivial that death isn't bad for the one who dies, and it's not one of my worries. One of my worries is the death of my loved ones, and I don't think we talk about death of others enough, because their deaths is still a thing that we encounter and we have to deal with. And so in that way, death is bad for the one who dies. Death is still a thing. And my question is, are there any arguments or any philosophical views that argue that maybe other people's deaths aren't even bad for us either, and we shouldn't worry about those either?
So thanks, that's a really interesting question. So I think on the one hand, I mean, reflecting on the kinds of arguments at least purport to show that death isn't bad for the one who dies, it can at least help the grieving put things in perspective. I mean, this of course assumes you accept those arguments, which I don't, so I'm putting on a very strange sort of hat here by saying, well, if I accepted the arguments that I don't think work, I would still think that these arguments could still help us think that maybe death wasn't as bad for the person who died. But I don't think those arguments could possibly show that they're not bad for us, because I mean, on any reasonable view of well-being, the maintenance of these kinds of relationships are going to be one of the primary drivers of well-being, and death is going to mark the end of that relationship. So I don't think any philosophical argument worth taking very seriously would establish that kind of thing, although it might help us understand why life has the value that it does.
I'm going to refer to a book I haven't read, but I recently read a review of. Other people might have read it, by Samuel Scheffler, who doesn't speak specifically to your question, but thinks about the importance for us of the fact that the human race is not going to die out. And he does a thought experiment. What would it be like if we knew that humanity was going to disappear in 20 years? And he puts to us that that would take away all meaning from our life, that in ways we don't understand, the importance and meaningfulness of all our projects and enterprises depends on the idea they're part of an ongoing process that's going to continue indefinitely. And it really is quite something to think about, how you would feel if everything was, if all human life was going to disappear. So, to that extent, if he's right, I think that pretty much everything that's important to us depends on not the continued life of particular loved ones, but the continued life of humanity in general.
So a very clinical perspective that kind of touches on your question a bit. Cicely Saunders, of course, quite famously said, "How we die remains in the memory of those who live on," and palliative care, one of its aims is to care for the patient's family and loved ones as well as the patient themselves. Quite an interesting study came out of Australia recently. A guy called David Currow looked at the impact of palliative care on getting back to work in people with severe bereavement, so bereaved relatives, how long they spent off work. And he found that it was something like relatives who had had palliative care support got back to work 6 months earlier than those who didn't. So there was an enormous net economic gain for palliative care.
We haven't talked about, but I think about from time to time, how bad the death of a loved one is depends hugely on when in their life they die. And my own view is that death when I'm in my 90s and very tired, it's not going to be such a terrible thing. There's some research that shows that death of infants is not nearly as distressing for those close to them than the death of an 18-year-old, which is a terrible thing. And so there's something about the life being cut off that's going and cut off at the wrong time that I think is very important about the death of loved ones.
One actually, an interesting data point is the criticism you often see in sort of philosophy on the constant of the last 30 years is that people focus too much on the example of one's own death. The sort of existentialism, when it talks about death, it always talks about your own death, the impendingness of your own death, how you look at that. There's not enough focus precisely on the point you raised, that what really brings us up is the death of another person, how we make sense of that. So there does seem to be this kind of structural bias in a lot of the philosophical literature. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to, sorry, we'll do, while we get a mic down here, we go up here first.
I wanted to ask a question, and I might be particularly interested in the clinical perspective on this as well. So I want to propose that my Aunt Jane is writing this book on the butterflies of, was it Sussex or something? East Sussex.
His aunt's doing this.
Well, what a funny coincidence. And she's not yet deceased, but she's now suffering from severe dementia. And while she has now spent 15 years writing this book, she's now changed her mind about it completely and thinks we should just all toss it out because who bothers about the butterflies anyway? And let's say my sister maintains that, well, Aunt Jane always wanted this book to be published, so I think this was her original wish, let's try and make this happen anyway. But my brother might maintain that, well, she doesn't want it anymore, so I guess this sort of trades on the idea of is it about the desired fulfillment that she used to have, or about what will bring her pleasure now. And if a person changed their mind and perhaps became mentally incapable, how might you solve that issue?
Shall I give a quick, sort of very straightforward clinical answer? So I've never been in this clinical situation regarding books of butterflies, funnily enough. But we quite often are in this situation making decisions with patients who have lost capacity, so they can't make decisions about certain things for themselves, about where they want to be, do they want to be, should they go to a nursing home, should they not, are they safe to be at home? So this is a really common clinical scenario, really. And the mental capacity law is quite clear about what we do. We act in the patient's best interests, and we look at, if they don't have capacity, then we ask their people close to them and get an idea for what their views might have been. So that is what I do. I have never thought to think whether their views might have changed until I take that into consideration.
So I think that's just a terribly deep and difficult question, and it doesn't just arise with dementia, it arises with the fact that human beings extend through time and make decisions, as it were, for their whole selves, even though their values can change over time. And it's not quite clear. People who think about decision theory and rationality, they can't really square the fact that I can commit myself to doing something that when I'm young, I commit myself to giving all my money to charity, but when I'm 40 years old, I'm going to be much more conservative, and who should rule the roost here? There's an issue that comes up in connection with dementia, which I don't know if Catherine's thought about. You often find people thinking about committing suicide or arranging their death, lest they turn into somebody who's lost many of their faculties. But it's not obvious to me that my 65-year-old self should be making decisions about the end of the life of my 80-year-old self. My 80-year-old self, who might have forgotten about these issues, could be living a perfectly happy life worth living. And so again, there are questions about the authority of one stage of you to make decisions that affect a later stage.
Is part of your question about desire and pleasure, or is part of your question about desire and desire?
Desire and pleasure.
Right.
So say it will bring a discomfort now to have to finish work.
Right.
Even some smaller amount of discomfort, but there are legal issues to pass through before I'd be able to function the name, and we would want to go through this if we don't believe that this is genuinely what she wants to be, or she isn't.
So I think part of why I couldn't begin to answer this question is that there's a question about well-being, which is going to be impossibly difficult to answer, which was sort of, from her perspective, what would be the best outcome for her. That's very tricky, right? Because we have two selves divided in time, and what would please one would frustrate the desire of an earlier self. I tend to rank pleasure ahead of desire satisfaction, so I kind of pulled in that direction. But then there's the sort of ethical, moral question about what we should do. And insofar as I think that's not going to be determined primarily by considerations of welfare, I just feel like on the one hand, the welfare question, there's a clearer answer. Do what you can now that would be pleasant. That would be the thing that would maximize welfare. But the moral thing, that's really hard. I have no answer. So I would just defer to the law, because that seems safe.
Just to add, I think it is the trickiness of it is there could be a devaluing of your aunt's current values on the grounds, and this is a tricky thing to do. Like our values go through transformations during various stages of our existence that accompany sometimes biological changes and things like that, and could be related to them. At what point do you say, this is a kind of a biological change where now I have the authority to devalue what you're currently saying is of value to you? That seems to me quite a tricky thing. It doesn't seem to be, there could be moral issues on both sides. I want to say that I think it's important respecting, talking honestly and directly to the person currently in front of you is something that has a special value of its own.
my main observation, just listening to this, is that in palliative care we work in multidisciplinary teams. It's one of the kind of hallmarks: doctors, nurses, chaplains, social workers. Now I'm thinking we need philosophers in our multidisciplinary meetings.
Not sure.
Look, thank you for a great debate. I just had one comment and then one dilemma to draw out a little bit. The comment was, in my time in clinical practice, I saw the clinical bioethicist become very much a part of my clinical team because there's so many different situations that have to be looked at individually. That was the comment. But the question, which is really drawn out, I think, by some of the questions from the audience and comments from the panel, that I wanted to pose is this. The average life expectancy at the start of the 20th century was 35 years. At the end, it was about 80. The young people in the audience today will live to an average of about 100. We've seen a wave of medical advances. Infectious disease largely fell first, not entirely. The improvements in cardiovascular medicine. We're seeing really major improvements in cancer therapeutics now. And the likelihood is that most people who pass away at around 100 will do so because of brain failure of one type or another. Most will be demented, most will have lost their functions. Their family will probably have said goodbye to them in one sense years before and be grateful for their passing, and so will they. So I'd just like the panel perhaps to speculate a little in the world of the future, where many of these, let's call them premature deaths, will have largely ceased, in the world of the future where the human body will have lived its full natural span, and we'll be looking at a rather different societal situation.
Okay. Full natural span is a tricky question. 35 was the full natural span, right? So what we regard as natural will shift as the age shifts as well. There are other more pressing worries as well about how we deal with long-term care, like living with your parents, which is we're all going to have to do. Our parents are going to have to live with us, and you'll be living with your children. Economically, it's just not possible. On the bright side, we're also due a global pandemic or two, so things should get thinned out a little bit.
Yeah.
But the societal changes that we're trying to suggest are quite radical, that we'll have to go through regarding interpersonal relationships with the elderly as well. And just how, what counts as elderly, what counts as full lifespan is going to change quite radically. The care and issues about, say, dementia and the like will just be one aspect of the ways in which we'll have to reorient, I think, the values with regards to interpersonal relationships between people who have an 80-year variation living in the same society.
Yes, just to back that up. So, as somebody now, well, I can see my 70s quite close on. I don't really have the immortality worry that I aired earlier. I think more is better in the first instance. And somebody asked me a few years ago, would I like to be 20 again? And I said, no! It's really quite nice being older. There's a lot less struggle and angst. So these extended years are just fine. Second, as you say, the downside is that we will fade away, losing many of our faculties and being a burden to our children and friends. It's again not obvious to me this is such a terrible thing. I mean, if you have uncomfortable and unpleasant past few years, that's one thing. Having years that you don't have all your faculties is not so obvious to me. That's a terrible thing, even any more than it was terrible not having all my faculties when I was 4 years old. So I'm a fairly optimistic kind of person.
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree that it's great, isn't it? We've been so successful in medicine, and look how the average lifespan has increased, but the most troubling expression of that is frailty. For a long time, I think it was perceived that what that meant was that people are having longer periods of worse quality life. But actually, there's more newer thinking that people aren't having longer periods of frail, worse quality life, they're just having it later. So maybe it's not such a bad thing. I would still say that we need to plan for it. You know, we need to make our wishes known before we get to that stage, so that we don't have the kind of default life-saving intervention rigmarole that I think so many people get now, because maybe they haven't expressed those preferences.
Fantastic, thank you. And it's obviously a good example of how these kind of debates will connect with so many other issues. What's coming out here in issues, for example, of autonomy, of which stage of life gets to make decisions about later stages, and of whether we as outsiders or relations or loved ones can decide that someone's life quality or wishes are not as they may see it themselves, or in some sense, as John put it, devalued. We had another one, yes.
There's an upstairs one too.
There's actually somebody up here.
Sorry, yeah, I beg your pardon. Do you want to go? Yeah.
Okay.
So reconnecting to the last question, and also to some before, especially the one about bionics and about your comment about the quantity of money that's spent on palliative care as opposed to medical research. I was wondering, what's the moral perspective on working on elongating life more and more when my generation has been told we will have to have fewer and fewer children because there's not enough resources for everyone?
What do you do with the absence of resources? We don't know. We don't know. Does anyone want to talk?
Can I just say one thing, which is that I think it's important to raise the kind of question you're asking, because I do think people get fixated on length of life as opposed to quality of life. And it's nice to have a kind of philosophical discussion about whether it's worth extending life indefinitely, but then there should be a real discussion about whether some of those resources could just be used to improve the rather short lives that maybe not us in this room have, but other people have, right? Because other people live what look like pretty terrible short lives, and we could just help them live much better, longer lives without really that much investment in this kind of research that would extend lives. I think, if you're thinking about things from a kind of utilitarian standpoint, it's just not obvious that there should be so much focus on extending life, given that there's so many people who live terrible lives as it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've sort of established that immortality isn't necessarily good for self, and I think that it's also not good for society. Someone said, and I can't remember who it was, that without death, every birth would be a tragedy. And I think kind of makes some sense.
And the other thing you can see is how a lot of these issues that we've talked about will flip onto the unborn as well. So, for example, if you don't bring someone into existence, are you therefore harming them? So a lot of these debates are also going to come up on that scale too. Do we have, sorry, my apologies to the upstairs, I think we missed, do we have another question? Yeah, no, I just want to share. No, okay, good, so let's go back. Madam, yeah.
If you shouldn't commit suicide, or there's no justification for suicide, does that mean there has to be some kind of intrinsic value to life? So if you had someone who wanted to commit suicide but was physically prevented, like a prisoner, say, who really wanted to, but they were actually physically prevented from doing it, but no one would be affected by their death. They want to commit suicide, that's the only thing they ever think of. Surely their life doesn't have any value in the same way that their death would. I mean, I don't really understand how you could then say that you shouldn't commit suicide in that situation without saying that you have to want to preserve your life.
That's a good question. So, just to get clear, we're talking about a case where someone could take their life as being physically prevented from doing so. Their only reason for wanting to take their life is just that they want to. Something like that. Is that the kind of thought?
It might be because they think, maybe rightly, that their life isn't going to be worth living.
Is that the? I mean.
Well, they just they want to kill themselves. So you had a prisoner, and it doesn't make any difference to anybody else apart from them, perhaps whether they're alive or dead. They don't want to do anything. They stare at the wall all day, but they don't want to preserve their life. But they also can't physically end their life. So what's the difference between their life continuing and their life ending?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the question, to be honest, to the challenge implied in the question. What I wanted to suggest at the end was that although Kant, for example, was very much against suicide in general in a way that suggests that life itself was intrinsically valuable in a way that could never be contravened, there are other aspects there is another sense in which he thought that life is valuable just because human life is the essential carrier of our capacity to value things. It's part of what it is to be a rational agent who can do nothing. And that's what's very valuable, is our very capacity to take value in things. And there is an argument that there's a famous case, in fact, that Kant was in fact written to by a young woman called Maria von Herbert, who could no longer see the value in life. And Kant seems to have mistaken her for someone who was just a bit down in the dumps. And he just told her to suck it up, basically. It's your moral duty. It's a bit more complicated than that, but there is a sense in which he didn't engage her in the way that he ought to engage her, which was to try and probe the sense in which really does she feel like existence lacks value. I mean, you can be restricted from your capacity to do lots of things, but you might still value the little bit that you can do, including the prisoner. In fact, lots of prisoners do. And lifers as well do. You know, you can find value in that capacity you have. If, though, someone genuinely has no capacity left to take value in things, then there might be a question as to what value their life has. And Maria van Herbert sadly did kill herself at the end.
So we started 2 minutes late, so we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. Do we have anyone upstairs want to shot? Yes, we'll go to the back there first then, please.
I'm struck by the point that was made by John at the beginning, I think, that the value, the answer to all of these questions about death depends upon one's attitude to the value of life. And some of the debate is edged backwards and forwards between a view that the value of life just depends on experience, or perhaps, as this latter response indicated, it might depend on the value the person themselves finds in life. But I think there's quite a lot of people who intuitively feel that the value of life might be an objective thing. So someone might be mistaken about the lack of value in their own life. And that's consistent with the views that David was given earlier, that the value of someone's life might be affected unbeknownst to them, either during their life or later. But I wanted specifically to ask, in thinking about these relationships, what Kant would have thought about somebody who's committing suicide, not for their own, not because they don't see any value in life, but as a means of realising value in their life. And I'm surprised you were talking about the romantic version of people who seek death, when in the contemporary world there are a lot of people who seek death for a specific purpose, and following the example of the sunset, perhaps. I mean, there are people who take very high risks in order to achieve things. Maybe that gives a different perspective on the possibility of suicide.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. I mean, I several questions. I'm not sure I know what to say to all of them. There are all kinds of dangerous activities that give our lives meaning, right? And the question is, and it certainly isn't the case that life, the fact that we're existing at all, has some special sanctity in regards to those other kind of projects or purposes that we might be pursuing, though we might take risks with regards to our life in order to realize the other projects that we value. And so I think Kant would allow that we can engage in projects that are dangerous, but actively taking one's life as a symbol of meaning or something like that. I think he, as itself, that act itself having some kind of special value. I think he's deeply skeptical about those kinds of activities, rather than just say dying for a cause, which is perfectly fine if that's the only, you'd prefer to live, but live and fight for the cause, dying for the cause if you have to. But there's always a, I think what Kant is worried about is a broader way of how what I was trying to gesture at, it's a broader way we think about life and death in culture. If we think that death is just another thing in the negative column, or in the positive column rather, something that we can appeal to whenever we're in trouble, then we start to misunderstand the kind of centrality that life has in realizing all our kinds of projects. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly if I've answered your question, but it's a tricky one.
Okay, fantastic. And this is a great question. So, could you be mistaken about the value of your own life? Could you be wrong about it in some way? My apologies to people who still have a few questions. I think we're going to have to wrap this up. We have 2 questions. If you ask very quick questions, we can do them in 5 minutes. Do you have a quick question, sir? You do it quickly?
I think
yeah, no, we're going to do. I just waited for the mics. Yeah. Okay, do you want to go first? And we'll come down the throat.
It's just going back to the idea of the fear and if death is bad. So, to the panel, do you believe that if we fear, can we fear death less, and does it make it sort of less bad if we believe that there is a life after death? And then directly to Catherine, just personally, have you ever had an experience of someone dying, and has their experience been different because they believe that there is something more when they do die, and does that change their perspective?
Shall I answer that one quickly first?
Yeah.
Yes, but it's it can go either way, basically. So there is some work that's looked at religiosity or spirituality and shown that people who have very deep religious beliefs have sort of better deaths. But actually my anecdotal experience is that I've also seen the opposite, and I think it depends how reconciled you are with your God or your deity or whatever.
So part of what I liked about Epicurus' argument was that if you were certain that death is an experiential blank, right, there'd be nothing to fear. The thought being that having removed any uncertainty about there being, say, unpleasant experiential states after death, right, it wouldn't be an appropriate object of fear. But I have to say that while I sort of like that part of it, right, his sort of certainty about what actually happens when the lights go out, I find, should we really take it that seriously? I think most of us are going to assign some, at least negligible probability to the idea that we may be wrong about minds and bodies. And I think that actually, if I really did think that there was a realistic possibility of surviving death, I think I would be absolutely terrified of death. Because then, right, all of the uncertainty would come back. And not only that, but a lot of my friends who do philosophy of religion, right, they insist that like all of the terrible things that take place in the world, right, are just no reason at all to think that the deity that runs things, sort of as it were, isn't anything less than perfect and loves us fully. But then our experience of this world, right, gives me very little hope for what would happen later. It doesn't, as it were, extinguish all hope, right? But surely there's uncertainty, right? The whole idea is that there would be this deity that we have very uncertain knowledge of, who would sustain our lives forever. It does seem like a rather large gamble. Whereas at least with the Epicurean story, it's a bit bleak, but at least it's really easy to figure out. That's something.
I don't like the Epicurean story, and now when you're thinking that way, it reminds me of something Voltaire apparently said on his deathbed when he was asked, would you renounce Satan? And he said, now's not the time to be making enemies. And I think the philosophers I'm interested in start talking when belief in the afterlife is starting to die down, but now belief in the afterlife is back with Scheffler. It's just not a supernatural afterlife, it's different generations. But we have the same kind of worry about what if our value is going to be judged by them, it's uncertain what they're going to think of us as well. You know, it's just like they're replacing the data to. We better not make any enemies with the future generations either. I'm not say anything that we have to be a bit more careful.
Okay, Professor. So one more in the middle, please.
Hi. It felt to me like there was a bit of a disanalogy between the butterfly book and the experience machine. In the latter, it seemed like it was quite clear when the subject was that would be harmed by the lack of knowledge, where in the former, I wasn't so clear when the subject was. Do we have to reject like that kind of materialist perspective in order to accept that line of argument?
Well, the subject's dead in the bookcase, and in the experience machine not. But my argument was that didn't mean that their interests should now be ignored. I mean, Clayton raised the whole thing about when were you harmed? Well, suppose that your partner and your best friend are having this affair, you never find out. When do you get harmed? Well, I'd say kind of when they start doing it. And similarly, I'd say you get harmed in the same way. You don't know about it because you're dead when the book goes in the bin. So I kind of think dead. So what was Clayton talked about? No, I won't go into that. I kind of think dead people, they don't exist anymore, but they're still people we should take their interests into account. I don't see what's problematic about that.
Okay, and that direction, gentlemen. So there's going to be in chapters. There's going to be experience machines and wine for all. Join me in thanking the panel.